All right, so diving right into this idea of Canada, joining the EU, we're talking about a huge GE shift, and it's especially wild with everything that's going on. Trump getting sworn in again, and
Yeah.
you know his whole 51st state thing from a few years back.
Oh, yeah. That definitely adds another layer to this whole thing, doesn't it?
For sure.
Yeah.
And it seems like everyone's buzzing about that suggestion from The Economist, but to really get this, we got to look at more than just that article.
Yeah. Absolutely. Context is key.
Exactly. So we've got a couple more pieces to this puzzle. We've got a Wikipedia article all about Canada-EU relations, gives us the historical and political rundown. Then we've got a couple news articles about Canada joining Horizon Europe. That's the EU's huge research program. And to top it off, we've got a Washington Post piece on Trump's America First foreign policy and, how he sees America expanding its influence.
Sounds like we've got a lot to work with here.
Right. So the goal here isn't to convince you that Canada should or shouldn't join the EU. It's more about figuring out why this idea is even being talked about. Like, what makes this even kind of plausible?
I think that's the most interesting thing about this, right? It seems so out there, but then again, maybe it's not as crazy as it sounds.
Okay, so let's start with the Economist article, since that's what kind of kicked this whole thing off. They actually start with this funny story about the Whisky Wars. It's this rivalry between Canada and Denmark. They're fighting over a tiny Arctic island.
Oh yeah, I read about that. It's a great example of the dynamic between Canada and the EU. A little competitive, a little quirky, but at the end of the day, they share a lot of the same values.
Yeah, it's like sibling rivalry, but on an international scale. But then the Economist gets serious and lays out their main argument. They say that Canada has all this space and all these resources, and the EU, which is a lot more crowded, could really use those. Plus, like we were just talking about, there's the whole shared culture and values thing.
Yeah, and that's where it gets interesting. On the surface, it kind of makes sense, right? Canada needs closer allies. The EU needs what Canada has.
Right. But The Economist also talks about the counter-argument. They acknowledge that if Canada were to join the EU's customs union, it would really mess up their trade relationship with the U.S. I mean, that's their biggest trading partner.
Exactly, and that's what I love about The Economist. They throw out these bold, sometimes even a little crazy ideas, but they're always really intellectually honest. They're not necessarily saying this is what should happen. They're more like, what if we thought about it this way?
So it's less about telling Canada what to do and more about getting people to think about the possibilities.
Yeah, exactly.
Which, let's be real, is probably a good thing in this case.
Yeah.
But here's where things get even more interesting. Our Wikipedia article talks about how Canada and the EU actually have a long history of working together, going all the way back to the 1970s.
Oh, wow. Really? I didn't realize it went back that far.
Yeah. And it's not just, small agreements here and there. They have this big free trade agreement called CETA, the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement.
CETA, yeah. That's a pretty big deal.
Hold on, I got to ask. CETA, what's that all about?
Well, basically, it gets rid of almost all the tariffs between Canada and the EU, which means it's way cheaper for Canadian businesses to sell their stuff in Europe and vice versa. It also makes it easier for people to, move between the two for work or school. It's actually been called one of the most ambitious trade deals the EU has ever signed with a non-EU country.
Wow, so this isn't just some theoretical alliance. There's already a real strong relationship there.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole EU membership idea even remotely plausible. It's still a long shot, don't get me wrong, but the fact that they've got this strong relationship, that makes it at least conceivable.
It's like they're already halfway there.
In a way, yeah. And it's not just CETA either. Apparently, European editorialists have been suggesting this since like 2005.
So this idea has been floating around for a while then.
It has. And then you add in the fact that Canada just recently joined Horizon Europe, the EU's huge research and innovation program.
Right, so now they're working together on all this cutting-edge science and technology.
It all points to a pretty interesting picture, this long history of working together, the shared commitment to free trade and science. It really sets the stage for a deeper look at what closer ties between Canada and the EU could actually look like.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of collaboration and shared interests. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, right? The Trump factor.
Yeah, for sure. That's where our Washington Post article comes in.
Okay, let's get into that. So the Washington Post piece highlights some of Trump's, let's just say, more unconventional ideas about foreign policy. They mention his threats of trade wars with Canada and Mexico during his first term, his talk about taking over Greenland and the Panama Canal, and of course there's the whole Canada as the 51st state thing.
Right. And it's important to remember that Trump's foreign policy has often been seen as unorthodox, you could say.
To put it lightly.
Mm.
But what's really interesting is that all of this, especially the 51st state comment, might actually give us some clues about how he might approach Canada in this second term.
That's a really good point, and it raises a lot of questions. How will his policies impact Canada's relationship with the U.S.? Will it push Canada further away from the U.S. and closer to the EU?
Okay, so we've got The Economist proposing this bold idea, this long history of strong relations between Canada and the EU. And then we've got this wild card, Trump and his America First agenda. It's like all these forces are coming together, creating this really dynamic geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder what's going to happen next. We're not just talking about theories here. We're talking about real-world stuff, changes in global power, and how those changes could affect entire nations. Yeah, it really makes you wonder, what does this all mean for Canada? And why should we even care about this? This seems pretty far out there.
Right. It's easy to just brush this off as another one of the economist's crazy ideas.
Yeah.
But I think there's more to it than that. We're talking about some potentially massive shifts in global alliances. And those shifts, well, they could affect everyone.
It's all about the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
We're in a time where things are really uncertain, geopolitically speaking. Those old alliances are being put to the test, and new ones are popping up all the time. You've got China on the rise, Russia's back in the game, and then there's U.S. foreign policy under Trump. It's anyone's guess what's going to happen next. All of that is reshaping how the world works.
So Canada's kind of stuck in the middle of it all. They've got this long history with the U.S., their biggest trading partner, closest ally. But on the flip side, the U.S. is becoming more isolationist, more focused on themselves, maybe not as reliable a partner as they used to be.
Exactly. And that's where the EU comes in. They're looking for ways to get stronger on the world stage. A closer partnership with Canada, well, that could be good for both of them. EU needs resources. Canada needs reliable partners who share their values.
It's kind of like a perfect storm then. Canada's looking for new opportunities, EU's looking for new partners, and they already have this strong foundation to build on.
Yeah, it's definitely a compelling story. And it's important to remember that history is full of these unlikely alliances. Things change, and suddenly countries find themselves working together in ways you'd never expect. Sometimes those partnerships are the ones that work out the best.
So is it really that out there to think that Canada might actually join the EU?
Well, I wouldn't say it's likely anytime soon. There are definitely still some big obstacles, like what would it do to Canada's relationship with the U.S.? Joining the EU's customs union would probably cause trade problems with the U.S. That's something Canada's got to think really hard about.
It's a huge gamble, for
Yeah.
sure. But it's interesting, even just a few years ago, this would have sounded totally crazy. And now it's at least a possibility, even if it's a long shot.
It shows you how fast things are changing. The old rules don't really apply anymore, and countries are having to figure out who their friends are all over again.
Okay, so let's play devil's advocate for a minute. Say Canada did join the EU. What would that look like? What would happen?
Ooh, that's a great question. If Canada joined the EU, it would be a total game changer. You'd have the biggest free trade zone in the world, from Vancouver all the way to Vladivostok. The EU would have way more resources, way more power on the world stage. It would be a big signal to everyone else that the EU is a force to be reckoned with.
But wouldn't there be a ton of challenges too?
Of course. It would be a massive project. You'd have to integrate Canada's whole economy and legal system into the EU, and there would definitely be cultural differences and political disagreements to work through. It wouldn't be easy, that's for sure.
So it's not just about the good stuff. It's about weighing that against all the potential problems and risks.
Exactly. That's the real debate here. Is it worth the risk? Is Canada willing to risk their relationship with the U.S. to get closer to the EU? Those are tough questions, no easy answers.
So we've talked about the history, the potential benefits, the risks. But let's bring it back to the people listening. Why should they care about this? What's the takeaway here?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is this. The world is becoming more complicated, more connected. Decisions made by one country can have a huge impact on everyone else. And it's becoming more important than ever for people to understand what's going on in the world and how it might affect their lives.
So even though this Canada-EU thing might seem like some far-off political thing, it could actually change a lot about how the world works.
Absolutely. And that's why it's important to pay attention, to ask questions, and to really think about the information you're getting.
Right. Because in a world where everything is connected,
Yeah.
even the craziest ideas can become reality.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it? We went from this kind of fun what-if scenario to talking about the future of global power.
And that's what's so cool about these deep dives.
Yeah.
We start with a simple question, and then boom, all these layers of complexity. We've talked about the economics, the politics, all that. But what about the people? Like, what would it actually be like for Canadians if this happened?
Oh, that's where things get really interesting. We're talking about a potential culture clash, Canadians would suddenly be able to travel, work, study all over Europe.
And Europeans could come to Canada. It'd be this massive exchange of ideas, cultures.
Exactly. And don't forget about stuff like immigration and social programs. Lots to figure out there.
It makes you wonder what kind of culture would come out of all this. Would it be this smooth blend, or would there be like friction?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Only time would tell. But it shows that this isn't just about politics and economics. It's about people and how their lives could change.
So we've covered a lot of ground here: the history, potential benefits, the risks, the culture. What's the bottom line for our listeners?
I think the main thing is that the world is changing, and fast. All the old rules are going out the window, and new possibilities are opening up. Stuff that seemed impossible a few years ago is now at least something people are talking about.
And that's exciting. Means we're living in a time of crazy change and opportunity. But it also means we need to be more aware, more informed. We got to be willing to question everything we thought we knew about how the world works.
Absolutely. We need to be ready to adapt. And it all starts with being curious, asking questions, and trying to see things from different perspectives.
We can't predict the future, but we can at least be prepared for it.
Well said.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Canada and the EU. It's a conversation that's just getting started, and who knows what the future holds.
Until next time.